Section 4.4, Factoring Quadratic Expressions. Factoring is when we rewrite an expression as a product of its factors. There are many different ways that show you how to factor. I am going to stick to one way so that we don't confuse everyone, and this is called the magic box, okay? So if you're given a quadratic formula such as ax squared plus bx plus c, you are going to draw two things. You're going to draw a box or a rectangle, and you're going to draw an x. In the bottom left-hand side of the box is where you are going to put your first term, which is ax squared. In the top right-hand corner is where you're going to put your last term, which is c. The bottom of your x is where you're going to put your middle term, which is bx. And then you are going to multiply this diagonal together, and that's what goes on the top of it. So ax squared times c is acx squared. You are always looking for numbers that multiply to the top of the box, that add to the bottom of the box. You place those factors on both sides of the x. You also place those factors wherever you want to inside your box, okay? So you don't have to always write it in the top left or the bottom left, just as long as whatever goes on either side of the x goes on both sides. Our first example we are going to look at is factoring ax squared plus bx plus c when a is positive and negative 1. So our example is x squared plus 14x plus 40. Okay, and I'm going to show you by using the magic box. If you can factor this without the box, be my guest. So I'm going to draw my rectangle, and then I draw my x. Remember, the first term goes in the bottom left. The last term goes in the top right. The middle term goes in the bottom of your x. And then you multiply x squared times 40, and that goes in the top of your x. So I am looking for numbers that multiply to 40, that add to 14. So some of you guys may be able to come up with the numbers that multiply to 40 really easily. Otherwise, if I was you, I would suggest making a table of values, and I would start with 1. 1 times 40. There's no way those two numbers are going to add or subtract to give me 14. So then there's 2 times 20. Again, no way 2 plus 20 or 2 minus 20 is going to give me to 14. 3 doesn't go into 40, so we're going to skip that one. 4 times 10 gives me 40, and hopefully you know that 4 plus 10 gives you 14. So you just write 4x and then 10x. And again, it doesn't matter where you write those in your box. You write the 4x in one of the empty boxes, the 10x in the other empty box. So now we are going to look at the first column, okay? And you ask yourself, what does x squared and 4x have in common? They have x in common, okay? Now we look at the second column. What does 10x and 40 have in common? They both have a 10 in common. Now we need to look at our bottom row. What does x squared and 10x have in common? They have x. What does 4x and 40 have in common? They have the number 4. So out here on the outside of my box is my answer. My first factor is x plus 10. My second factor over here on the other side, x plus 4. And I knew to put plus signs in between them because it was a positive 10 and it was a positive 4. Our second example is x squared minus 11x plus 30. So I'm going to draw my rectangle. I'm going to draw my x. First term goes in the bottom left. Last term, top right. Middle term, bottom of the x. And you multiply the diagonal. So x squared times 30 gives me 30x squared in the top. Okay, so you're looking for numbers that multiply to 30 that are going to add to negative 11. So again, if you have no idea, start with 1. 1 times 30 is 30, but there's no way 1 plus 30 or 1 minus 30 is going to get you to 11. So then 2 times 15 gives you 30. You're getting close. 2 plus 15 gives me 17. 2 minus 15 gives me a negative 13. So then 3 times 10, again, doesn't give you 11. 3 plus 10 is 13. 10 minus 3 gives me 7. 4 doesn't go into 30, but 5 does. 5 times 6 gives me 30. 5 plus 6 gives me positive 11. Since I need them to be negative, negative 5 plus negative 6 gives me negative 11. So those are my two factors that go on either side. Those are the exact same factors that I fill into my box over here. So look at your first column. What does x squared and negative 5x have in common? X. Now, what does negative 6x and positive 30 have in common? They both have the number 6. 6 divided by 6 gives me 1. 30 divided by 6 gives me 5. Now, whenever this bottom box is negative, this number out in front has to be negative. Okay, now let's look at our bottom row. So what does x squared and negative 6x have in common? X. And then what does negative 5x and 30 have in common? Again, 5 goes into both of those numbers. Now, whenever this box is negative, this number out in front must also be negative. So remember, the numbers that are now on the outside of your box are your answers. So you write x minus 6 in one parenthesis. The other one is x minus 5. So remember, you always start with your x. Some of you guys might be tempted to write minus 5 plus x. It does mean the same thing. We just normally write our x terms first. Next, we're going to be looking at how we find the greatest common factor, which sometimes is shorthanded to the GCF. And this is a common factor between the terms, and you choose the highest common factor. Our third example is 9x squared plus 9x minus 18. So 9x squared is a term, 9x is a term, and negative 18 is a term. So you're looking for what does 9x squared, 9x, and negative 18 all have in common. So since all three of those do not have an x, they can't have a variable in common. So what number does both 9, 9, and negative 18 have in common? So hopefully you know that they have 9 in common. So you take 9x squared, you divide it by 9, and that leaves you with just x squared. Take 9x, divide it by 9, and that leaves you with just x. Take negative 18, divide it by 9, divide it by 9, and you get minus 2. So now, since I still have 3 terms inside my parentheses, I'm still going to try my magic box. First term, last term, middle term, x squared times negative 2 goes in the top. So, remember, what multiplies to negative 2? That adds to positive 1. So there aren't many numbers that multiply to 2. There's just basically 1 and 2. So I'm trying to make those two numbers multiply to a negative 2, but add to a positive 1. So since my x in the bottom is positive, that means my biggest number needs to be positive. So I make my 1 negative. So I write my 2x and my minus x or minus 1x, okay? Put that in your box wherever you want to. Look at your first column. What does 2x and x squared have in common? They have an x. What does minus 1x and minus 2 have in common? A minus 1. What does x squared and negative 1x have in common? An x. What does 2x and negative 2 have in common? A 2. You don't make it negative because that blue box is positive. So your factors are x minus 1, x plus 2 because 2 is positive, and then you bring the 9 down from out in front. So it factors to 9 times x minus 1 times x plus 2. Let's look at our fourth example. We have 7n squared minus 21. So this time we only have two terms, which is a little different, but don't let that bother you. So our first term is 7n squared. The second term is minus 21. And now think about what is a number that goes into both 7 and 21? 7 goes into both of those numbers, so I need to factor out a 7. So I take my first term, 7n squared, divide it by 7, and that leaves you with n squared. You take minus 21 and you divide it by 7, and that leaves you with minus 3. Since there's not 3 terms inside your parenthesis, you can't do your magic box, so that's where you're going to stop there. Now we are going to look at examples for when your first term doesn't have a 1 or a negative 1 in the front. So this time we have 4x squared plus 7x plus 3. So again, I'm going to draw my magic box. First term goes in the bottom left. Last term goes in the top right. Middle term goes in the bottom of your x. And 4x squared times 3 gives you 12x squared. So you're looking for something that multiplies to 12, that adds to 7. So 1 times 12 is 12, but 1 plus 12 or 1 minus 12 does not give me 7. 2 times 6 gives me 12, but 2 plus 6 is 8. 2 minus 6 gives me a negative 4, so close but not quite. 3 times 4 gives you 12, and 3 plus 4 gives you 7. So I write positive 3x, positive 4x. It does not matter where you place those in your box, so I write 3x and 4x. First column. What does 4x squared and 3x have in common? They both have those x's. Okay. What does 4x and 3 have in common? So they don't both have x's. There is not a number that both 4 and 3 have in common, so it's just going to be a positive 1. Okay, now look at my bottom row. What does 4x squared and 4x have in common? They both have a 4. They both have an x. Okay, 3x and 3, they both have a 3 in common. So your factors are x plus 1 and then 4x plus 3. I write plus signs because 1 was positive and 3 was positive on the outside of my box. Our last example is 2x squared minus 7x plus 6. So go ahead, draw your box. First term goes in the bottom left. Last term goes in the top right. Middle term in the bottom of my x. 2x squared times 6x, 2 times 6 is 12, goes in the top. So again, we're looking for numbers that multiply to 12, that add to negative 7. I know you might think this problem is similar to the last one, but I promise you it's different. So numbers that multiply to 12, 1 times 12, that doesn't add to 7. 2 times 6, that doesn't add to 7. 3 times 4 does, but since it's a negative 7, they must both be negative. So negative 3x minus 4x. Okay, look at the first column. What does 2x squared and negative 3x have in common? They both have an x. Okay, lately, whatever this number is the number that comes outside, but what is a number that both negative 4x and 6 both have in common? So I hope that you're thinking they're both even, so they have to factor out a 2, Remember, since this box is negative, on the outside, that 2 must also be negative. So now, bottom row, what does 2x squared and negative 4x have in common? They both have a 2. They both have an x. Bottom row, what does negative 3x and 6 have in common? 3 goes into both of those numbers. And again, since this left-hand box is minus, so is this number on the outside. So your factors are x minus 2 and 2x minus 3. Remember, your x always comes first.